Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. How are you today?
I'm good. How about yourself? Thank
Excellent. Thank you for having me today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for agreeing to chat with me. May I ask you to please tell us your name?
Certainly. My name is Ken Williams. I run a use of force police practices consultancy business, and I'm a retired law enforcement officer, detective with the city of Brockton.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So tell me this. Did you know you always wanted to be a law enforcement officer, even from a very young age, or was this kind of more happenstance? How did you decide upon law enforcement?
I think my career, I was in college studying electrical engineering, and I transitioned over later on into criminal justice. And law enforcement wasn't something that was on the radar in particular because, of course, being Black, many people in my community didn't talk about becoming law enforcement officers. I also went into the armed services. I was in the Army, so that's another conversation for another time. But the service and the police department kind of go hand in hand, I guess.
Absolutely. And so when you became a police officer, what were the things that you found, um, I guess, kind of shocking, and the things that you found that needed to be corrected, or did you go in and think, oh, this is exactly how I expected it to be? Or were there things about it that you said, oh my God, I can't believe this is how it works? And were there things you thought immediately that this needed change?
No, I went into police with my eyes wide open, being Black, being born in Boston, Massachusetts. Systemic racism in policing is known. I mean, as a kid, as a child, I saw people being, stop, question, frisked. I was subjected to stop, question, frisk as a child as well. Overzealous policing, where traffic stops in my community were different than in white communities. And I grew up in that environment. My mother, my stepmother and father, they were also activists at their time, and I learned from them that it's a lot better to be empowered than it is to be speechless, voiceless, not being present at the table. So law enforcement is one of those jobs that you can be present at the table to hopefully bring about change.
Excellent. So historically, what we know about law enforcement, at least some of the history suggests that it evolved from the slave patrols into what we now know as law enforcement. And is that the reason why you think it's dominated by white men specifically?
Yes, I mean, law enforcement began as slave patrols, and when we think about that history, it was predominantly dominated by white men. And it wasn't until the 1964 Civil Rights Act that we had a few members of the minority community that were in law enforcement before 1964. But since then, there have been more Blacks, more women, people of color that have entered the profession, but it's still predominantly white. And it's still systemically racist. And, we have to call it what it is.
Absolutely. And what's really interesting at this particular time, and I think again, it's that perfect storm of COVID that we're home, we're able to look at more news and television and social media, and we're seeing this, what some people would say a heightened number of Black and brown men killed, but that's not new, correct? I mean, this is something that's been going on even post Reconstruction, post Civil War, post Brown versus the Board of Education, post the EEOC equality. I mean, all of these laws have been put in place to protect people, but we still see a certain number of Black and brown people subject to dying in law enforcement. And I have a subsequent question after that when you answer this.
Sure. I mean, if we look at one of the more recent studies, and when I say recent, it's not that recent, but 50 years ago, there was a Kerner Commission report, which was a study that was done after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. And its findings said that law enforcement has always been systemically racist, and that there were two systems of justice. There was one white, one Black, and they were both unequal. So, if we have law enforcement that is at the, it's at the center of this, that's where, when we talk about the mass incarceration system, it begins with officers on the street that stop, question, and frisk individuals, and then introduce them into the criminal justice system. Law enforcement has always targeted Black people differently than white people, even though white people may have been similarly situated. And, when we look at today, with all of the unrest that's happening in the country, a lot of that still goes back to law enforcement being the catalyst of that.
Absolutely. I read something a couple of weeks ago that said that they collect statistics on how many Black and brown people are killed. I guess how many people just in general, but how many Black and brown people are killed by law enforcement. But certain agencies refuse to release that information. So there's no research that you can go and say, here's a place you can go find out how many Black men were killed in 2020 or how many brown men or whatever were killed in this year. Why is it that the information is so hard to come by? And is it more for, protecting the information because the FBI and others have massive criminal databases? So why is this information so reserved?
Sure. I mean, if you don't have data, you don't have findings, you don't have a chance to go and hold anyone accountable. And law enforcement, has made it clear, whether it's from the FBI, Congress, all these institutions that are supposed to protect people. If they don't have those findings, then there's no one that really can be held accountable for pattern and practice. And that's ultimately what it comes down to.
Yeah, but if you just did the regular search, Google search or whatever to find out, Black men killed in a specific year, you get this mishmash of information. So, if you type a specific name, or if you type in a phrase, Black Lives Matter, or say her name or say his name, you get some data, but the data is not aggregate. It's not something that you can go in and kind of pull some statistics to get how old is the average person killed by a law enforcement officer. But more importantly, the fact is that we don't know how pervasive people who are killed by law enforcement are across the United States, just in the United States. Why is that? Why don't we, and I appreciate what you said because we don't want findings, but why is it that we as a society cannot know what's happening in our communities and why this is continuing to happen?
Yeah, I mean, there was talk, always has been talk about trying to build a database that would have this information. A few years ago, some of the newspapers started gathering this information, and they would list, people who were killed by police officers and stuff. And that sparked a little bit more of the conversation as to why was it that the newspapers around the country and some over in the UK were gathering this stuff and putting it in a database, but yet and still the FBI and Congress and local law enforcement weren't divulging the same information. There's that one issue. The next issue becomes that if you start reporting how many times law enforcement as a profession is killing people, then you start raising even more eyebrows at the use of force that is being exacted against citizens. The cause of each case has to be investigated separately. But if the overarching finding is that it's systemically racist, then you prove the point, which is that it's still specifically targeting one group and not all groups similarly.
Absolutely. So during the height of COVID, there was a lot of talk about defunding the police. And some people made a point of using it as a political lightning rod, if you will, to do this. So what in your mind does defund the police means, and where does it fall in the spectrum of training law enforcement officers? So when someone passes the police academy, what training is necessary past that part? So can you talk a little bit about defunding and then training of a police officer?
Sure. I think generally defunding the police should mean trying to go and take some of the budget that's allocated to law enforcement and separating that so that maybe you hire mental health professionals that come in and work instead of having so many police officers in the division. Once there's attrition, people leave, or you purposefully make slots available for mental health professions. Police officers aren't mental health professions. They're not licensed to actually assess people's mental health or anything like that. So hiring people who have those type of expertise would be better than having a law enforcement officer respond to a call and shooting and killing someone simply because they're having an emotional breakdown. At the same time, defund the police for some people also means that because we have since the 60s taken billions, if not trillions of dollars and invested it into law enforcement, There's only one pie of funds. We've also taken the money that should have gone towards education. We've taken the funds that should have gone towards job creation and housing, and we've taken it and put it into law enforcement. And now 50 or so years later, we're reaping what we sow. We're reaping a society that has a lot of kids that are falling through the cracks in education. We have a lot of people who don't have adequate housing. And we have a lot of folks that are unemployed and can't get adequate job training to go and meet the next level to get out of poverty. So investing in law enforcement is a losing proposition and not a winning proposition.
So even as a police officer, did you feel like you had all the equipment and all the training you needed in order to perform your job successfully?
I did. I mean, as a police officer, I don't think I need a tank to go out and patrol the street. As a police officer, I don't believe I need to go and have military-styled equipment or training to do community service and community policing. Community policing is supposed to be based on a law enforcement officer having a contact with the citizens to go and take on their needs, find out what people in the community are willing to speak and talk about their needs, and then also at the same time build a trust between you and the community that you serve. You can't build a trust if you have a barrier between you and the people that you're serving. If you don't have walking beats, if you don't have community police forums where people can actually air their grievances, if you don't have a proper complaint system where people can walk in the door and actually file a complaint against a police officer that abused them or abused somebody else, you're not getting anywhere with that community to build trust. So in law enforcement, as far as I'm concerned, they could strip away a lot of those tools, which would also cut the budget considerably.
Yeah. So one of the things, if you read the police language, specifically codes about police behavior, and I'm not so sure it's universal, i.e. it's across the entire United States, but I think there's something in the Constitution that talks about this in the Fourth Amendment. So you as a citizen do not have the right to lie to law enforcement. That could be construed as a crime. You as a citizen are running away from police officers or trying to evade arrest or some kind of custody is against police behavior and police codes and laws. And those things can be considered as evading the interests of the government. So if you are pulled over and you run away or you drive away or whatever it is, the use of force, specifically legal force, may not necessarily be illegal because you are evading the interests of that government or the federal government, whatever entity it is. What exactly does that mean? So what rights do I have as a citizen? So you have pulled me over. I have an expired driver's license, and you say, okay, well, I'm going to arrest you. And so that comes into my mind, I need to escape this. I can't, I got to protect my children, whatever the reason is that you run. What exactly does that mean that you have the right to use some level of force to prevent me from evading the interests of the government or the organization that's leading there? What exactly does that mean?
Sure. I think there are two different issues that you just raised. One is intent. Just because the officer believes that you're trying to evade doesn't necessarily mean that you had the intent to evade. And in law, in order to be found responsible for things, usually you have to be negligent or intentionally negligent in your actions. So that's one issue. The next issue becomes that, let's say, for instance, you are evading and you are, you don't want to comply because you don't want to go to jail that day. Something's going on in your life and that's going to ruin it. And you start to take off running. That doesn't mean that the officer under the Fourth Amendment standard has the right to whip out a gun and say, I'm going to shoot you in your back because I don't feel like chasing after you. that doesn't fly in the under the Constitution. What the Constitution does say is that the use of reasonable force has to be force matched with force. So what that means is that if the person poses an immediate threat to the officer or the general public, then, based on what the officer knows at that moment in time, if the person committed a bank robbery, for instance, and shot people inside the bank and is now outside the bank and is, still armed and dangerous, the officer has an immediate threat. They have to make a decision at that moment in time. But if the person, for instance, if we switch that scenario up, the person goes in, steals a pack of gum, is unarmed, and walks out the store, that does not mean that that person poses an immediate threat. Both people stole something, and they have the possessions in their custody, and they both intentionally did something wrong, but both actors are not treated the same under the reasonable force standard. And that's important for people to understand, especially people in law enforcement. For instance, the recent case of Adam Toledo in Chicago, a youth, he has a gun, he's running away from police, officer gives him orders to stop, drop it. The young child does so, and he's no longer armed, his hands are up in the air, and he gets shot in the chest for complying with police. Was there an immediate threat after he dropped the gun? No. Is it reasonable for the officer to shoot such a young child if he's not armed and there's no immediate threat? As far as I'm concerned, no. So, I mean, those are the type of things that we have to have discussions about.
Absolutely. So one of the pieces of this that's really interesting to me is policing in America versus policing in the world. So places like London and other people. So the everyday police officer, the person who's going to stop a traffic violation, a domestic situation, whatever it is, those people are not armed with guns. They need to call another level of police officers when they need to have, some type of force applied. Why is it that America, everyone can have a gun, anyone that's legal or has not done something that the state or the federal government describes as a violation of your right to carry, your Second Amendment right? Why is it that some organizations or some countries and some places see that the use and carrying of a gun creates more of a threat for everybody in the situation versus other countries which have modulated ways of infecting law enforcement?
Sure. I mean, in those other countries, they don't have the same beginning as America. America was founded on acts of terror against people using firearms. The Second Amendment that eventually comes along says, under the Second Amendment, every able-bodied white, under the Militia Act, that is, every able-bodied white male ages 18 to 45 would bear arms to control 100% of the other people who were in the population. The indigenous people, the African Americans, everyone else would be controlled, and African Americans were prohibited from bearing arms for self-defense. That's the beginning of this country. So the firearm has been a tool used to defeat the indigenous people who had bows and arrows, and it's been used to control and imprison millions of Black people against their will for several hundred years. It's a very valuable tool to these people. And when we look at the history, it's very clear that now we're stuck with maybe 300 million guns in America, and trying to strip away those guns would probably be almost impossible to do.
Right, because you can have a gun illegally too. You don't have to buy it through normal means. And I know that the laws say that if you buy from a gun dealer, the gun dealer is supposed to report that you bought the gun, what you bought, the ammunition and all that stuff. But now anybody can buy a gun legally or illegally and have a weapon. And
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I was about to say, I mean, and now we're getting into the day and age where people can print, using a printer. They can print out parts of a firearm, and is it actually a firearm or something like that now becomes the detail of how the law is written on whether or not it's actually a firearm and stuff. And we have all types of things that people do. They'll take a slide of a firearm that's a legal firearm, they'll put it on the body and receiver of something else, and they'll say that it's not a firearm, even though it has a projectile and gunpowder and all that stuff, that a firing pin that makes it a firearm. So there are all types of things that are happening today. But at the end of the day, the old traditional firearm that is been around for a long time is a very, very effective tool at killing people, and at threatening to kill people or controlling people. And there are many of them out there in America, whereas some of these other countries, their stricter gun laws have maybe not allowed guns to proliferate in their society as badly as it has in America.
Yeah, absolutely. And the technology you're talking about is 3D printing. And with the 3D printer, you can print a whole gun. You can make the entire gun. You have the materials, you can print a whole gun. You can make a whole gun. And whether it's a true weapon or whether it's a BB gun or whatever the technology is, a play gun, it looks almost exactly like a real gun. So, I mean, I do understand why people have concern about these technologies, but that's the future, right? So we're not going to have, huge steel and iron mills and all that stuff, because now you can go find some scrap materials, put it together in your 3D printer and print whatever you want to. But one of the pieces that's really concerning to me is like, so the right to carry a gun is covered in the Second Amendment. Here are the terms of where you can and cannot. But if I have committed a crime, and I guess it has to be a felony, it can't be just a misdemeanor or a simple crime, but if I've committed, I might lose my right to carry a gun. So now,
well, you can lose your right to carry a gun if you committed a misdemeanor that was a domestic violence situation as well.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that clarification. But now that means that we can ensure that some communities do not have open access to a gun. So, i.e., like your right to vote becomes up for debate if you committed certain crimes. So now your right to carry a gun literally is chipping away at your rights as a citizen because you've made an infraction. Whereas if you look at the people we've glorified as criminals over our society, so the entire mafia thing was glorified, the early Billy the Kid, Jesse James, and all these other people who are doing, they become legends and icons in our society for committing crimes, and we laud them, whereas the average Black person or brown person or a person of marginalized means, when they commit a crime, it is a crime against society and it doesn't need to be celebrated. It doesn't need to be recognized, So how is it that we turn ourselves upside down to prevent one group from having access or the right to carry a gun and enhancing other groups to have a right to carry a gun? And I get that is a part of the history of America, but why is it still this way today? Why is it that we're still carrying forth the idea that we're going to take away some of your human rights, your citizens' rights, your civil rights, because you are now categorized as this thing here, and whatever this thing is, a felon, whatever criminal we've defined you as? Why is that?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of white people who commit crimes that never see the judge or go to jail. And a lot of those people are let go by police officers in their day-to-day interactions, whether or not the police officer knows exactly what they've committed and let them go, or made a discretionary decision to let them go is a whole nother matter. But Black people don't have that same experience. Black people have had overzealous policing, and the contacts that Black people have had with law enforcement as a general percentage is going to make it so that law enforcement can justify its existence by using the penal system to punish Black people differently than white people. So that's one issue. So it's not so much that white people don't commit as many crimes as Black people. They commit more because there are more white people in America than Black people or brown people. At the same time, we also have to peel that onion back and realize that, yes, historically, white people who were under the Militia Act, ordered by Congress to bear arms, they were all criminals, and the government protected them and told them to go get arms. When we fast forward and we think about the Union splitting from, the South and stuff like that, those were all criminals. Those are all treasonous, terrorist criminals, the KKK criminals. All of these groups are criminals, but the government has never stepped in to say, you know what, let's make laws where, these people that we can identify. If we had a KKK rally right now today out in the street, why isn't law enforcement out there using facial recognition technology to go and scan the crowd, get all the IDs, do a background research to figure out who has a license to carry, and knock on their door that day or later the next day and say, we're going to take away your weapons? Why doesn't government do that? Because those people should be unfit to go and carry. If we look at what the history has taught us, is that after the Civil War, when we had 200,000 Black men, Lincoln relaxes the Militia Act because the Union Army is about to lose the Civil War to the South. Lincoln relaxes the Militia Act because Douglas says, I'll go out and get some Black folks to come and fight this war to win. And then all of a sudden Lincoln says, okay, Black men, here you go, here go your arms, go out there and kill the enemy. and black men went out there and killed the enemy, and then the Union prevailed, those states then all of a sudden said, hey, you know what? We didn't have legal gun licensure before, but let's create these laws now to go and strip away these firearms that these black folks now had. There's so many of them out there that have guns now. Let's strip it away, and let's make a system that will make it even harder for the future generations to go and possess and bear a firearm. And that's where we're at right now. You know, if you live in Chicago and you're black and you want to go and carry a concealed weapon, I'm sure there are many more white people who are concealed weapon owners and licensed carriers than there are people of color. And if you go state by state, you know, that'll be the case state by state, because ultimately a firearm is a very, very powerful tool. And you know, white folks have historically wanted to keep that to themselves. And until we have, you know, an understanding that even in law enforcement, if we have people, members of law enforcement, who are exacting abuse under the color of law, using a firearm to do so, they themselves are posing a danger to everyone in society, but yet and still they keep their guns too. And these are conversations that are important to have.
Absolutely. So I want to ask one other question, then I want to talk to you a little bit about your career. But first, let me ask this one other question. So we are no longer, slavery is no longer an option. It's no longer something we practice legally in the United States. So, but there are people who are in jail who have to do work. So whether they're making clothes in the jail, you know, whatever it is, they're doing things, they're going out and doing stuff in the community, cleaning up the streets and all that stuff. And under the argument that you are paying back your debt to society. So first I'm incarcerated, and now I've got to go out and do manual or some type of labor to make the society better. And I may get pennies, but not very much money, or I may find myself you know, getting, maybe I might get out earlier if I've done good behavior, if I've done something, but literally you've turned people that are held in custody into slaves again, because now they have to do more labor for a society that's not paying them a fair wage. So if we look at slavery historically, there was no wage, there was nothing, but now we've done it under a system that under the guise does not look like true slavery. But in a way it is, because, you know, maybe the mattress you're sleeping on, maybe the blanket that you're using, maybe something was made in a prison camp, in a prison. How is that not akin to slavery? How is that not slavery? How is that not a violation of that person's rights? Why do I have to do these things?
Yeah, I mean, it is slavery. The 13th Amendment makes it clear that, you know, when we have servitude in a penal system, you forfeit certain rights under the Constitution, not every right, but certain rights, and that the state now owns you, basically. I believe in some penal systems, they'll say, you know, do you want to volunteer to do this and that? And some people will do it. And of course, like you stated, they're not being paid a fair wage. They're not being paid for the work that they're performing. They're being paid below that fair market wage. You know, something that happened in this last presidential, well, before Biden and Harris, when the Trump presidential election happened, that, you know, I took note of, and I'm sure others took note of, when, you know, we have people that are in government and they say things like, you know, Mexico's going to pay for the wall, or you know, these terms that they're using. You know, behind the scenes, I always thought that meant that when they started, you know, locking children up at the border and parents up at the border, that they were going to turn around and take those prisoners that they acquired and have them start building a wall. And I'm sure in their minds, deep seated in their heads, that's what they intended, you know, was to go and have this new labor that was going to be brought from Mexico, from the border. Fortunately, that didn't come to pass. We didn't get a second term of Trump. I'm sure it would have happened in the second term. But, you know, when we think about people in America who are locked up, and most of them, a lot of them, for low-level possessionary offenses, are Black and brown people, and they're put into this penal system, and they're going to lose 12 months and maybe a day of their lives. What do you do for 12 months in a day? You're trying to go and figure out how to go and work off some of the time to maybe get released a little earlier. And when someone comes to you and says, hey, if you go work for 2 cents an hour, we'll knock off, X number of hours for every hour that you work, you're probably going to volunteer, so-called volunteer to do that. But at the end of the day, it's still slave wages, it's still slavery, and it's still the same system that we had, before the Civil War. It's just legalized slavery.
Absolutely. So tell us, what is use of force and what is a use of force expert?
Yeah, use of force in police work. Use of force is a standard that police officers are taught at the basic academy. It's a legal standard. Whenever you have a police officer that is, either giving verbal, they can be a situation where they're offering verbal commands all the way up to presenting a firearm. A firearm would be considered deadly force. Is what's called a use of force continuum. And in that use of force continuum, the officer has to go and make judgment calls based on the level of resistance that they're meeting with a person who they look to either arrest or they're trying to control. And what the law states is that under the Fourth Amendment, their case law that the Supreme Court has made decisions on, that at a minimum, an officer's force has to be viewed as objectively reasonable. And the objectively reasonable standard is assessed by other officers, which is kind of weird. You would think that would be the general public that would weigh in and say whether or not something was, looking unfair or unjust, but yet the standard isn't what the general public sees. It's what an officer assessing what that officer was going through at that moment in time based on their actions, whether or not it was reasonable or not. And that's where we have the rub, I believe, between society and law enforcement, because in many instances, the force used was objectively unreasonable instead of it being reasonable. For instance, the case of Adam Toledo. Adam Toledo is unarmed, but the officer's claim is that, within a split second, he had to make a decision on using deadly force to stop what he perceived to be an immediate threat. So the general public may have a trial where they get a chance to weigh in on this, but when it's the administrative side of things where the police are investigating the police, the general public doesn't get a chance to go and offer their input as far as what they believe is or is not fair, is not just.
Mm-hmm. And so now, what is a use of force expert, such as yourself? Can you describe what you do and how you became what you became? How did you become a use of force expert?
Sure. The use of force expert is hired by either plaintiffs or defendants. And a use of force expert has usually law enforcement experience dealing with, and has training, specialized training that deals with use of force. So an expert will come along and they'll assess, they'll review cases that typically involve use of deadly force. Sometimes it's not use of deadly force, but typically it's use of deadly force. And they'll get a chance to review all of the internal affair files. They'll get a chance to review the officer's statements. They'll get a chance to review the civilian statements. And using a unbiased view, they'll make a decision, a determination on whether or not the officer used reasonable force or not. And then they'll author a report based on what they see. And after they author that report, the side that has hired them will determine whether or not they want to go and take that report and use it towards defending their client. Sometimes in certain matters, I'll review a case and my decisions don't help the person who hired me. So they won't use my opinions, but they'll use me as a consultant in the backdrop to kind of look at what the issues are with their case. Other times we part ways because there's no need for me to go further with them, because unfortunately I then become potentially a witness for them or against them. So, the use of force expert helps to but helps to teach a jury, during questioning of what happened, what transpired outside that court, helps to answer some of the questions for a jury based on their experiences of what was reasonable or not. And that's basically what it comes down to, along with the judge. I mean, there may be issues that the judge doesn't have experience with, so the expert is able to fill the gap in some of that area as well.
Excellent. So how do you prevent bias or your own thoughts to from entering into your decisions and your thought processes? So I'll give you an example. There's a lot of talk about judges. So judges are still products of their community, products of where they were raised, products of what they experienced. So they must find a way to prevent that self-knowledge from impeding on the legal knowledge. So how do you, as a use of force expert, do that? How do you balance your experiences? So you said you had been, stopped by police officers in your youth. How do you prevent those kinds of experiences from leaking into your work as an expert?
Yeah, I think the best way that anyone stays tethered to the community as well as their practice, their profession. I read a lot as far as looking at what the standards are that the government sets, as far as like Department of Justice. If they go in and they look at having a consent decree against the department, I'll read through to get a better understanding of the technical issues that they faced and how they examined their findings and what some of the practices were, and match that up against some of the legal issues that were maybe civil rights violations and things that the department was using improperly against citizens. And at the same time, I stay connected to the community by going out into community and volunteering my time and talking with ordinary everyday citizens about some of these issues to get that flavor as far as what's happening on that side of the fence. And I marry the two. I marry the two based on the most unbiased position I believe I can present. I know there are a lot of white people that have never walked in my shoes, so I don't know how they can, be as fair and unbiased as I can be, because if they've never experienced, the negative effects of discrimination or racism, then that's something that they can't talk about or touch on. Whereas I think being Black, we get a chance based on our existence in America to try to go and, see it from both sides. We can see it. We can see from our disadvantage point, the disadvantages and the advantages that white people have, whereas white people, I don't believe, see those same things. They don't understand what white privilege looks like. Black people and people of color and women can identify that pretty easily, I believe.
Absolutely. So my last set of questions is about terms. I want you to define some of these terms here. What is the prone position? What is a taser? What is, I guess the best way I think I could describe this is what does it mean to be in custody? So we know it means you lose some of your freedoms, but what does it mean to be in custody? And then what are the terms that you use to define a criminal? So like we talked about misdemeanor, felonies. What do these terms all mean? Because I think a lot of us miss the language of law enforcement. We assume we know what they mean, but we may not, right? And so, you define use of force for us very well. Thank you very much for that. But there are a lot of other terms that we don't know that we assume we know, so as many as you can, and maybe some I didn't even articulate, but can you describe some of the common acronyms and terms used in law enforcement?
And like I said, I mean, that use of force description, I didn't want to get too technical with case law and all that stuff, because I think everyone gets lost in the woods with that, So the prone position, quite simply, is, an officer asks you to go and, prone out, which is to lay down on the ground and not have your hands tucked underneath you. And that gives them, I believe, a sense that they now have a superior control over the situation, because if a person has to get up off the ground, that gives them time to react, more time to react. But a taser is an electronic device that is a less than lethal force device that essentially has an electric charge. There are two ways to use a taser. There is where you can be up close to a person. It has two prongs, and you can shock the person into some sort of submission by pain. You also have a chance to use a taser at a distance away from an individual, where it'll have two probes that will fire from the device, and those two prongs are attached to wires that have an electric current. And once they hit the body, they complete an electric circuit, and you can then pull, and the electric circuit will activate, and then that releases a charge that also causes pain and immobilizes the person temporarily, so that you could theoretically gain control over them. So
let me ask you a question about that. So in our hearts, we have an electrical charge. So now, and when you're shooting a taser, and it shoots out these electrical charges, that's electricity being put in the body. And then you've got this electrical charge that happens in your heart. Is there any risk from being shot by a taser of causing someone to have a heart attack or some kind of other condition happen to them because they've been shot with a taser?
Sure, just because the device is less than lethal doesn't mean that it can't cause a lethal result. So, I mean, there have been people who have, died from a heart attack. The probes themselves, when they go into the skin, they stay in the skin. You have to pull them out. There's some pain associated with that as well. Sometimes there have been causes, I guess, cases where the probe itself has caused some searing or burning around the skin, causing that to have some discomfort. So I mean, any device, anything that is less than lethal has the risk, I mean, of causing death. It's supposed to be a smaller percentage, of course, than maybe a firearm being used, but there is that risk.
Okay. So what does it mean to be in custody? So I've been taken into custody. Tell me what that means. And do I have any rights when I'm in custody?
Sure. So there are different levels. Like, let's say, for instance, you and I are on a street corner, and I'm detaining you. That's not custody. That's a temporary situation where you don't have to worry about Miranda or anything that's being used against you in talking with you. Custody is something else. Custody is usually triggered by some sort of control that the police have over you. You're not free to leave. It's made clear that you don't have a freedom to leave, and maybe police are investigating some sort of crime. And now, if you say things that may be used against you, the police officers have to go and think about Mirandizing you beforehand, because you should have a right to go and clam up, not saying anything to them that could be used against you. So custody typically involves, let's say, for instance, a person is on the street, they're maybe considered a suspect, and the police officer says, well, I need you to come with me back to the station so that I can ask you questions. And then they put them in the back of the cruiser and they bring them to the police station. They didn't show up freely. They didn't show up voluntarily. They're there with the police. There is some sort of custody issue that could be argued. So they're going to have to be Mirandized, most likely, before questioning begins. The other part of custody is you're under arrest. You're in police custody. It's made clear that the police had probable cause to arrest you, and they actually take you to jail. While you're in their custody, and let's say, for instance, you're in a jail cell waiting to be brought up to a courthouse to have an arraignment. In between that time, now police, while you're in their custody, can say, do you want to talk to me about what we arrested you for? And you have a chance to go and say yes or no. But some people do say yes. And let's say, for instance, they bring you to an interview room. They're going to, again, have to Mirandize you, give you another legal statement that says that you're going to be brought before the court as soon as possible, and that you don't have to necessarily answer any questions. And that itself is a custody issue as well.
Okay, so you brought up a lot of interesting things. So Miranda's. So it's a statute. It says what you can and can't do when you're in custody. So tell us, what is a Miranda statement that's given to a person that's in custody or somehow unaccused?
Sure, you basically have a right to remain silent. Anything that you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. And at the same time, if you go through the statement, it says that at any point in time that you feel that you don't want to answer a question, you can stop. You don't have to answer any questions if you don't feel comfortable asking any questions. And you have a right to an attorney to be present before answering questions. And the Miranda form will have a signature for the person to sign off that they acknowledge their Miranda rights, and the police officer will sign off on it, and it'll be dated. And typically these days, a lot of this stuff is recorded as well, so that there's the argument of being coerced into signing away your rights might be minimized, or maybe proven if it's on a recording that you were threatened, that if you didn't sign it, something else might happen to you, which can occur.
Absolutely. Okay, so now I've had my Miranda warning, and I have decided, or let me go back. I haven't been taken into custody, but I know I'm going to be arrested, or I know that there's something that I may have done that you're going to may come and get me to investigate me and something I've done. And so I show up with an attorney. Why is it that law enforcement considers that suspect that you show up with an attorney when giving all the rights and tools that they have, right? So if you're drinking a cup of coffee and you put your DNA on the coffee, they may keep your cup. They can lie to you and tell you, we found your DNA on something another. All these things can happen. But the fact that I showed up to this interrogation, for the lack of anything else on the record, I'm considered suspect. Why is that?
In law enforcement, they hate to have someone be smart enough to introduce an attorney. An attorney is going to protect their rights. It's going to probably stop any questions that may find, put their client in trouble and stuff like that, because their client shouldn't have to go and volunteer information if they have these rights. I mean, it's their right to go and make sure that they don't incriminate themselves. Mm-hmm. And, anybody that talks to the police, whether you're doing so voluntarily or you're on a street corner and you're doing it voluntarily, or you're in a police station and you're doing it under an interrogation and custody type situation, the issue still becomes that everything is being recorded by that officer. Every statement that you may think is trivial, it may become the thing that the police are using to kind of frame out why it is they kind of circled the wagons around you. And a lot of times just remaining silent is the best thing. You know what I mean?
Yep, absolutely. Okay, so this is my last term. Impugn the defendant, right? So this has been talked a lot about in rape cases, right? So we try to make a woman look like she brought this on herself because the way she dressed, or because she was drinking, or something like that. So, or we say that the person is a drug addict, or the person is prone to violence, or whatever it is. What's the advantage of destroying the witness without actually accurately presenting the facts? And I think I understand what that is, but I just want to know, we hear this so much about impugning someone's character, right? I'm going to try to destroy you. What is the advantage of that if you want the truth and justice to come out?
No, it depends. I mean, let's say, for instance, in the case of George Floyd versus Derek Chauvin, the state versus Derek Chauvin. George Floyd shouldn't be on trial, but yet and still impugning his character by trying to say and introduce evidence that he had a drug habit and things like that are to go and help, the defense try to go and paint this image to the jury that, Mr. Floyd deserved somehow for him to be stopped by the police that day, and that they're trying to remove or create doubt that it was Derek Chauvin's knee that caused his death, that somehow he put his lips around the tailpipe of the cruiser and sucked on fumes from the cruiser, and that caused his death. These are the things that impugning someone's character can cause, or try to cause, is create this doubt. Whether or not it's successful or not, that's up to the jury to go and make their decision about. But hopefully, in a case like that, they won't fall for the trickery. For law enforcement, let's say, for instance, you have a witness that you thought was going to be a good witness, and then all of a sudden the witness starts saying things on the witness stand. The prosecution's probably going to start treating that person as a hostile witness. They may even start impugning the person's character, even though they started off with, "This is our witness." You might find that at the end of the day, they start impugning the person's character if they start saying things that become detrimental to the prosecution's case. So it works on both sides.
Absolutely. And so I thought I only have one last question, but I do have one more question. So
Sure.
There's this. So possessing a counterfeit $20 bill, loose cigarettes, DVDs, selling these on a corner, or having these in your possession, or doing these things, are these typically crimes that escalate to the point that you need a lot of police officers, you need a lot of deadly force in order to stop the activity? So I'm on the street corner, I'm selling loose cigarettes. And if you go into New York, you know, that happens all the time. You know, people are selling, well, they used to, I don't know if people still smoke cigarettes or not, but people sell loose cigarettes or DVDs or something of that nature. What type of crime is that? And what is the response to that kind of crime?
Sure. I mean, you know, the person who is selling a loosey cigarette, we're talking about basically they're defeating the taxes that are earned by that state, that commonwealth for the loosey. You know, that's ultimately what it comes down to. You know, when we think about you know, Eric Garner being killed, stop, question, frisked over the sale of a loosey cigarette, supposed alleged sale of a loosey cigarette. We still don't even know if that really occurred. That just may have been the police trying to figure out a way to go and stop, question, and frisk him and justify their existence. You know, the man was killed over the sale of a loosey. You know, it's crazy. Why would police, you know, stop that person for that because he's Black? You know, that wouldn't occur in a white neighborhood. I'm sure there are people in white neighborhoods that don't have the money to go and buy $10 packs of smokes, and they don't mind going out and buying loosey cigarettes because that's the most affordable way for them to go and get their smoke. The same thing happens in the Black community. There are people who can't afford the taxes that boost up the price of the tobacco product, but they can afford maybe to buy the loosey cigarette, and that's how they do it. So there's that one aspect. There's the other aspect of it where the government says, well, you know, some of these smokes that are being sold as loosies are counterfeit, or they came across state lines from a state that had lower taxes, and they're defeating paying the taxes in this state, and they make it this huge crime. Is it worth someone getting killed over? No, it isn't. It shouldn't occur like that. The other question, I'm sorry.
So the other part was, you know, so as like, well, in Mr. Floyd's case, they said he had a counterfeit $20 bill. Are these felonies? Are they misdemeanors? How does law enforcement see these behaviors? And why is it that it brings with it all of these police officers? So in the case of Mr. Garner, he's standing on a corner. Obviously he's not armed. He doesn't have any weapon. I don't know what he had on his person, but you know, obviously from what we can see from the video, he was not armed. But it brought such a, you know, it started off with like 2 or 3 police officers, and then you get a swarm of police officers. I believe the same thing happened in Mr. Floyd's case. So, you know, so here he is, you know, whatever they are accusing him allegedly of, you know, that brings 4 or 5 police officers. Why is that a response for crimes like this?
You know, in the case of Mr. Floyd, they've never produced the so-called alleged $20 counterfeit bill. I have no idea whether or not that was a crime or not. All I know is that you know, police, when they did respond, they very quickly, he was cooperative. They very quickly had him in custody because he had handcuffs on. And you know, the response by other police officers at that time should have been minimized, because there's no more chance of Mr. Floyd breaking free from police really and running down the street. He was handcuffed. He was in their custody. Whether they had to sit there for an hour to negotiate a good way for him to get in the vehicle, or if he had, you know, I believe he complained that he had a medical condition and that the car was too tight for him to sit in, and that he wanted to go and be transported a different way. What's the problem with calling an ambulance and having him transported to a hospital? And, you know, it's a $20, you know, counterfeit bill, if that's what they're alleging. He could have been booked at the hospital and released forthwith at the hospital. So this idea that someone has to get in the back of a cruiser and be taken and formally booked at a police agency and all that stuff is archaic in itself. You know, in this day and age of computers, if you want to file, you know, you can have people summoned into court without even having them presented at a police station these days. So this idea that people have to actually go to a police station is pretty absurd too, when it's a low level offense.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for chatting with us. I want to leave I think we have 5 minutes. What time do you have? Do you have something we didn't cover, or something you want to talk about that I didn't address?
Yeah, I think, one of the things that we didn't discuss, but we started to discuss, I think is worth going into are these cigarette issues. We had decriminalization of marijuana that is taking place in America. And, that has been by far since the 70s, one of the biggest tools in the war on drug chest to stop, question, and frisk Black people, more so than white people. White people smoke marijuana the same as Black folks, if not more, because there are more white people in America. But yet and still, they're underrepresented in the penal system for that criminal offense. So when we think about decriminalization of marijuana, and now we have Black people being stopped, questioned, and frisked in droves over a loosey cigarette, we have to go and use and proceed with caution, because the unintended consequence of having laws that enable police to look at a cigarette as being a crime. In many communities, they're discussing banning menthol cigarettes, for instance. If you're against tobacco smoke because it causes cancer and you're concerned about the health consequences of someone's actions smoking cigarettes, then ban all tobacco products. Don't ban just one particular product. In many communities, what they're doing is they're specifically banning menthol cigarettes. And white people don't traditionally smoke menthols. It's usually people who are Black and brown who do. So what they're creating in these bans and these laws is a reasonable suspicion for a police officer, to see and spot someone in the minority community with a cigarette in their hand, to go and proceed and say, well, maybe that's a banned substance. Maybe that's a menthol cigarette. Maybe I should go stop, question, and frisk them for that, which presents itself as being reasonable suspicion. And then what we're doing is we're creating a legal pathway for people to be harassed by law enforcement in the Black and brown communities. And again, white people who smoke a similar substance that causes the same amount of death aren't subjected to the same type of law enforcement presence. We're creating a law that creates overzealous policing, and we should stop that.
Absolutely. Ken, I'm really grateful for you chatting with me on a wonderful Sunday afternoon. I hope your weather there is nice. We have fairly decent weather. It's been a little cool here, but fairly decent weather. I want to ask one last question before I end the recording. Please tell us, as a use of force expert, as a police officer, as a person who's familiar with laws, what would you tell the average citizen to protect themselves in their interactions, daily interactions? And I'll give you one example. So a lot of people I talk to in these conversations, specifically white people, when a blue light shows up in the back of their car, they worry about how much this is going to cost me. Am I going to get a ticket? Is my insurance rate's going to go up? Whatever it is. For Black and brown people, when that blue light shows up in the back of your window, you're trying to make sure that your person makes it home safely. Your interaction does not turn deadly. So with that context, how would you tell us to behave in the event that those blue lights are in our window, or we having our doors kicked in, or whatever, however we're encountering law enforcement? How would you tell us to stay safe?
That's a that question, keeps being raised in the Black community and answered differently than the white community. The white community says, you know what, you get a First Amendment right to ask why you are being stopped, questioned, frisked, and you get a chance to go and understand that the laws will protect you. In the Black community, we preach, keep your hands on the steering wheel, stick your hands out the window, do everything 100% right. And yet still we have people that are being shot and killed. So for the Black community, specifically, there is no real solution for that. If someone's going to violate you, you could be the kindest, gentlest person. You could be like the lieutenant in Virginia who rolled down his windows, was in uniform, stuck both hands out the window, and was being ordered by one police officer to undo a seatbelt at gunpoint, and the other officer at gunpoint telling him to show him his hands. And if he had probably reached in that car to undo a seatbelt, he might not be here today. Absolutely. And he didn't do anything wrong. So, these conversations that we have, are very troubling because they don't work. They can't be applied practically to someone who wants to go out there and harm us. If someone has the intent to do that harm, they've specifically racially profiled us specifically stopped us. They, many a car zoomed by them that were speeding, for instance, but they specifically waited to see it was a brown person in the car to stop the car. That person has in their heart and in their minds predisposed to something that, we can be the most compliant people on the planet, but still find ourselves in the worst possible situation. So all we can do is try to go and comply to survive, but sometimes complying and surviving isn't going to be enough. Sandra Bland realized that. She was simply smoking a cigarette when she was stopped in Texas. The officer told her to put out the cigarette. Last time I checked, you have the freedom to smoke a cigarette. That doesn't cause a danger. Yet and still Sandra Bland isn't here today over a cigarette.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ken. I appreciate this very much. You're going to have to come back. We need some more education. We need to know more about these terms. I think this chat has the potential to educate people in ways that we may not normally do. We all think we have the language down, but in reality, we don't know what these words mean and how they impact us, specifically in Black and Brown communities. We fear the police in ways that are not necessarily the same for our white colleagues. And they are there to protect and serve. So we need more people like you to help us understand how to navigate this system and what's the language to navigate the system, so thank you again. I really appreciate this. Thank you so much. I'll send you a link as soon as the video converts. Please watch it and let me know if I may upload it, but please come back as well.
I do appreciate you. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your Sunday.
You too.
Bye.